September 13th, 1999. It's week 1 of the NFL season, and we find ourselves at Mile High for this AFC battle under the lights on Monday Night Football between the Miami Dolphins and the Denver Broncos. I could list 10,000 reasons why this game was a big deal, from the fact that it was a nationally televised game and the marquee game of the week, to the fact that it was the day that the Denver Broncos were going to raise their championship banner, to the fact that this was a rematch of the 1998 divisional round, to the fact that John Elway was getting his number retired, to the fact that this was the start of a brand new era in Denver, as after winning the last 2 Super Bowls and being the top dog in the NFL, it was the start of life without John Elway. However, despite what felt like a momentous game for the Broncos, it was the Miami Dolphins who spoiled the party for the defending champions, as the Dolphins ended up taking this game by a final score of 38-21, with the new era of Broncos football starting off on a whimper. Dan Marino played one of his last good games as a pro, going 15 for 23 with 215 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, and a passer rating of 124.4, all while the Miami offense did not turn the ball over once and did not get sacked once. Miami's defense got some big sacks, including one on 4th down in the 4th quarter, and the Dolphins led it 38-14 with a minute to go in the game before a garbage time touchdown. For a Miami team that many people had high expectations for, it was a big win, and it helped get at least some revenge on the Broncos for what happened 9 months prior in their divisional round loss, where Terrell Davis just ran wild, as he did for just about every game of that 1998 season. So you would think that this would be a happy moment for the Dolphins. You would think that everything would be smooth sailing and there wouldn't be any issues afterwards following this win right here, right? Well, not quite. Because after the game, all of the talk was not about how the Dolphins played, but rather how the Dolphins returned to Miami. Because they decided to pick a fight and go public with a feud against none other than American Airlines. And if you think that this is an over-exaggeration on my end and think it was an offhand comment by one person, think again. Because after this game, head coach Jimmy Johnson decided that it was time to wage war on one of the biggest airlines in the world and the biggest airline in the United States, almost getting himself arrested in the process. Seriously. Because this is the story behind the bizarre, yet somehow completely true feud between the Miami Dolphins and American Airlines. Make sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. Because we post every day about crazy stories from NFL history that you might not know about, like this one, because let's be honest, where else are you finding videos about the connection between the Dolphins and American Airlines? Thanks in advance for liking and subscribing and helping the channel out a lot. And with that in mind, let's talk about the incident that made the Dolphins go from sky high after a win to a crash landing. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand this event right here, Hurricane Floyd. I don't think I'm revealing anything crazy when I say that hurricanes are a big problem in Miami around August and September. There is a reason why the college team that shares the stadium with the Dolphins today is literally called the Hurricanes. The Dolphins have had their season impacted by hurricanes many times before. In 1992, they had to take a bye week during the first week of the season because their game against the New England Patriots, which was scheduled to be played in Miami, couldn't be played because of Hurricane Andrew. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. In 2004, the first game of the season against the Tennessee Titans was moved from Sunday to Saturday, being moved up a day to avoid a hurricane. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. A game against the Kansas City Chiefs in 2005 was moved from Sunday to Friday to avoid Hurricane Wilma, and that was in mid-October, which is definitely not hurricane season. And in 2017, the Dolphins had to take a week 1 bye because of Hurricane Irma, as their opening game was postponed and moved to week 11. Bottom line, the Dolphins have had a lot of issues in the past due to hurricanes, and any home game that the Dolphins have in September should have a buyer beware and a proceed with caution label on it, because a hurricane could hit the area and delay the contest, or move it up a little bit. And in 1999, hurricane season was no exception, as after the Dolphins were traveling back to Miami following their game against the Broncos, they were going to be landing right as Hurricane Floyd, this hurricane right here, was set to touch down. Floyd was projected to be the worst hurricane to hit Miami since Hurricane Andrew in 1992. And the damage was significant across the country. 85 people died. Over 2.6 million people along the East Coast, particularly the Carolinas, were forced to evacuate, and over $6.5 billion in damages was caused. To give you an idea of how bad Hurricane Floyd was projected to be, even though the impact to Florida was relatively minimal, with no one dying there, Disney World was shut down. That tells you everything when Walt Disney World thinks that this is such a bad hurricane that they decide to close. Initially, Floyd was a Category 4, though again, it did not manage to hit Florida as bad as it could have, surprisingly turning eastward. Having said that, there were rains and high winds, making it very unsafe for flights to land and making it very unsafe to be outside. And with some companies not wanting to take any chances with their employees being stuck in the airport or being in danger or being outside working baggage and whatnot, many flights were canceled across the southeast, which makes sense because the last thing you want to do in a hurricane is fly and put not just the lives of people on the ground at risk, but the lives of people in the sky. And one of those flights that had to be diverted was none other than the Dolphins flight after their game against the Broncos, which did not please Jimmy Johnson whatsoever. Because due to the hurricane, instead of the team landing in Miami or Fort Lauderdale, which would have been a routine drive back to the facility, the team was forced to land in Fort Myers, because American Airlines had supposedly sent its employees home that were working in Miami and Fort Lauderdale. And that's a big difference, because Fort Myers is on the opposite side of the state, being on the west coast of Florida instead of the east coast, and being about 150 miles away from the team's stadium. There is a massive difference between landing at an airport less than 20 miles away and an airport 150 miles away. It's like if, instead of landing in New York City at JFK or LaGuardia, you landed in Hartford, Connecticut. Little bit of a difference there. The Dolphins were already getting in on a red-eye, so they were already tired. And now, because none of the employees were working, they had to land somewhere else and drive across the state as the hurricane's about to hit. And that's not ideal. Now, it would be one thing if, due to this hurricane, Fort Lauderdale and Miami had their airports closed. At that point, there's nothing you can do. You can't blame the pilot or American Airlines for not being able to land a plane in an airport that's closed. However, this is where the story gets a lot more interesting, especially when it comes to this man right here, because he was not too happy about finding out the fact that both airports in Miami and Fort Lauderdale were still open. Yes, American Airlines sent its employees home, so it wasn't a case of American Airlines picking and choosing what flights could be in there and discriminating against the Dolphins. But there were other airlines that were still taking flights and were operating, and the storm was not expected to hit at the time the Dolphins arrived back to Florida before 6 a.m. You're telling me your guys aren't working when the airports are open and when it's not quote-unquote dangerous just yet? You're going to make us adjust our plans when most airlines are doing their job, but not you? Yeah, this man right here, Jimmy Johnson, he was ticked off about this. And he went as far as saying that he would quit the team if he had to fly American Airlines again. I am not kidding. This went from a weather incident that caused a change in travel plans, which happens a couple of times per year across the NFL, depending on hurricanes and storms and snow and whatnot, and it's not really a major story, to an all-out war with the biggest airline in the United States. Because Johnson spoke to the press, and in no uncertain terms, he lashed out at his frustration about American Airlines not doing its job properly. Before I talk about the quote, I want you to think back to 2012, which is the same time away from 1999 as 2012 is from today, which makes me feel really old, when Mike Tomlin and the Pittsburgh Steelers changed their travel plans and lost their hotel accommodations in New Jersey before playing the New York Giants, because the hotels were being used as shelter for those looking for a place to evacuate after Hurricane Sandy. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Now compare that and how understanding of the situation caused by a hurricane Mike Tomlin was, and how rational and level-headed he was, to that of Jimmy Johnson. And you might notice a difference. Because as Johnson said, write this down, I will never, ever fly American Airlines again, I would rather drive to our next home game than fly with them. Remember when the Dolphins owner said I could coach the home games and Dave Wannstedt, the assistant, could coach the road games? If I have to fly American again, maybe that's what I'll do. Johnson, who nearly retired after the 1998 season as it was threatening to half retire again because of this awful experience with American Airlines. Even floating the idea of doing road trips, which oddly enough, the final road game that Jimmy Johnson had outside the state of Florida happened to be in Seattle, which is quite the long road trip if you want to do that. Seattle and Miami are the two furthest cities from each other in the National Football League. But Johnson even floated this idea mid-flight to Dave Wannstedt, who was so ticked off at Johnson and annoyed with his behavior that he just shook his head and went into the bathroom. At one point, I kid you not, Jimmy Johnson was so frustrated that he was in the cockpit, somehow working his way to the front of the plane to talk to the pilot himself and wonder why he couldn't land the plane in Miami or Fort Lauderdale. As he said, I was up in the cabin talking to the pilot, and we're talking about the airports being closed. And he said, the airports aren't closed. So I asked him why we couldn't land, and he said the airline sent everybody home. Keep in mind, going into the cockpit mid-flight and threatening the pilot to land somewhere is a literal crime. Like, you cannot do that. You cannot just go into the cockpit because you're upset about the way the pilot is flying the plane and because you're upset that your plane got diverted. Granted, this was a pre-9/11 world, but today, this can carry a maximum prison sentence of 20 years and a pretty hefty fine per 49 USC Code 46504. I get that Johnson was upset because we're all upset when travel plans change. But you can't just do this and intimidate the pilot and the crew by going into the cockpit and then yelling to the media and other coaches on the plane that you're never going to have the Dolphins fly American Airlines again. Especially because American Airlines doesn't have its employees at the airport because the company wants to give them enough time to evacuate themselves and their families to somewhere that might be safer, and especially because United, Delta, and TWA at some point that Tuesday all halted flights in and out of Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Despite Johnson's best wishes, or I guess, despite his demands, seeing as he basically threatened to half retire if they had to fly American again, the Dolphins continued to fly American Airlines. While team president Eddie Jones made the displeasure to the airline clear, whatever that means, he also said that the team would continue to fly American. My guess on that, if I had to speculate, was that Jones spoke to the airline and said, I'm not sure why we couldn't land, but I sincerely apologize for our coach breaking the laws of the airspace, and I really don't want to have to scramble to find a new contract mid-season for flights for our next 7 road games, plus the playoffs. Let's just stick with the game plan. There's not going to be another hurricane. Jimmy Johnson, he'll get over this. And seeing as the Dolphins flew American for the rest of the season and continued to fly it until American Airlines cut ties with them and a few other teams prior to the start of 2017, I'm just going to assume that the relationship was mended pretty quickly, especially with Jimmy Johnson retiring after the 1999 season anyways. And for what it's worth, it seemed like a lot of people sided with American Airlines on this, and you'd be hard-pressed to find too many people who took Jimmy's side. One person wrote into the South Florida Sun-Sentinel and said, over 200,000 evacuated their homes in preparation for Hurricane Floyd. Others were on call, working long hours, getting ready for the storm. But you complain about having to ride first class in a 757 jet and then being so inconvenient to take a 2-hour bus ride to get home. Another said that he was appalled and that he had no idea how Johnson didn't understand that American Airlines was doing this to protect their employees and their families. Understanding Johnson's frustration and condoning his actions are two very different things. And yeah, even if you get why he's frustrated, it's very hard to condone what Johnson did here in light of everything that happened. Because the only thing rockier than Jimmy Johnson's relationship with Jerry Jones in the 1990s was his relationship with American Airlines. Be sure to like and subscribe if you have not done so already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and check out my other channels, JG8 for the history of college football, JG7 for the history of baseball, and JG9 News, where we talk about all things happening in the NFL. Join me every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we'll play live NFL trivia for cash prizes. And make sure to join me live, as we're on stream just about every single day. And thanks to all our Patreon members and our YouTube members for helping out the channel. See how you can become a member and show your support financially in the description down below.